Well, hello, everybody. There is a battle taking place. In fact, it's raging, and it's raging particularly on social media. For anybody who spends just a couple minutes on X, will be inundated with this fight of sorts, this civil war taking place within Christian circles. And by admission of its combatants, including the combatant that we're going to focus on in this episode, Tucker Carlson, the battle is theological. Now, Tucker will claim that the theology of his nemesis, the Christian Zionists, who he'll tell you have steered America's foreign policy, especially as it relates to Israel in the last few decades, that their theology is the oldest Christian heresy known. Therefore, he's come to correct it with his own theology, which he believes is Orthodox Christian theology. But what I'm going to prove to you in this particular episode is that it's Tucker's theology that's related to the oldest heresy there is. In fact, this heresy is so old that it actually predates Christianity. Now, the name of this heresy is Gnosticism, and I'll say a lot more about it in the progress of this video. But I want to begin the video with this first clip in which Tucker identifies what he believes to be the oldest Christian heresy. So take a listen, and I'll be back with you in just a moment.
And the last thing that I think we need to do to restore balance between the relationship between the United States and Israel and to restore some sanity to the public conversation on this topic is to get our theology right. And this is not a message aimed at Israelis or Jews. This is a message aimed at Christians, who are the largest group of Israel supporters in the United States. And their view of Israel is colored not just by sentimental attachment, which is fine, or trips to Israel, great, no problem, but by a Christian heresy, the oldest of the Christian heresies, which is that God somehow prefers some people based on their DNA. And of course, the whole point of Christianity is that that is no longer true, that there is no chosen people. The chosen people are people who choose Jesus. That is the Christian message right there. It's not an anti-Semitic message, by the way. It's the Christian message. It's the core Christian message. And yet there are many self-described representatives of the Christian faith, the world's largest, who are daily sending a different message. And we should be very clear, whatever this is, it's not Christianity, it is heresy. That God loves some people more because of their DNA, that is not the Christian message. That's the opposite of the Christian message. The Christian message is universal. That's the whole point of it. The chosen people in Christianity are those who choose Jesus. The entire New Testament is that story. And anyone who says otherwise has not read it or is lying. God does not prefer you because of your DNA or anyone else because of their DNA, period.
So there you have it. According to Tucker Carlson, the oldest Christian heresy is this heresy that God favors or prefers or loves some people, and it's obvious that here he's referring in context to the Jews, that God loves the Jews more than the non-Jews. And this, of course, violates the heart of Christian theology, which is universal in scope. So again, the oldest Christian heresy, that God loves the Jews more than the Gentiles. Now, is Tucker right? Well, as it relates to what we call New Testament soteriology or salvation, Tucker would be right. In other words, according to the New Testament, God has no favorites as it relates to his extending new covenant salvation to Jews, Gentiles, males, females, slaves, or free people. So, Steve, where is he wrong? Well, like every lie, including the original lie told in the Garden of Eden by that wily serpent, every lie has to have some truth, or nobody would take the bait and believe the lie. So, where's the lie in Tucker's presentation that we just heard? Well, let's say it's a lie that's both a sin of omission as well as just basic confusion. So, what's the sin of omission here? According to Tucker, who is a classic Christian supersessionist, also known as replacement theology, but preferred by many of its adherents to be called fulfillment theology, covenant theology. According to these people, there's always been just one covenant, and it begins as far back as Adam's children, Cain and Abel. Now, you recall that when it comes to Adam's two children, Cain and Abel, God preferred the one, Abel, over the other, Cain. For the one offered an animal sacrifice, which we know or will learn later is consistent with God's own demands, okay, that there can be no forgiveness of sin without the shedding of blood, whereas the other, Cain, offers something from the fruit of his produce. He was a farmer. So Cain kills Abel, and this, of course, incurs the wrath of God and causes God to banish Cain forever. Cain becomes this wandering person. We've all heard of the mark of Cain. People would not be allowed to kill Cain, but he would wander the earth forever as sort of a vagabond. Abel was the one that found favor, and therefore, to the Christian, Abel was saved and Cain wasn't. Likewise, a couple generations later, we read in the book of Genesis that Noah found favor with God among all other people in his generation, okay, and Noah alone. So again, the Christian would see that as Noah was saved, and maybe by extent his three sons, okay, with their wives, while the rest of the world was lost. So what supersessionists or fulfillment theologists, or again, covenant theologists, believe is that throughout the whole of the Hebrew Bible, which they prefer to call the Old Testament, there's really always been only one covenant that threads its way through the entirety of the Old Testament narrative. Abel was saved. In other words, he was part of the early church, and this is how supersessionists tend to see this, okay, that it's always been about the church, okay, and here the pre-Jesus existing church in their view, okay, so Abel's part of that church, Noah's part of that church, and this one covenant continues to thread itself through the whole of the Old Testament. Abraham's included in it, probably Isaac and Jacob too. David, of course, we would believe was part of it. And this covenant continues to meander its way through the whole of the Bible until it reaches its fruition, its climax, if you will, in Jesus's New Testament, in Jesus's covenant of salvation. And the church that is born with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is basically now that covenant vastly expanded to now include millions of Gentiles and others, Jews and Gentiles, that have been grafted into this original covenant, if you will. The problem is it's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible does not teach that there's just this one covenant, okay, this covenant of salvation, if you will, or this like nascent pre-New Testament gospel, okay? But rather, the Bible teaches that there's many covenants, and several of them are concurrently operating in this very day, one alongside the other. So, for example, the first covenant that I'll mention is the covenant of Noah. Okay, the Noahide covenant. Now, what's at the heart of that covenant? We learn that after the flood, God tells Noah that when he or any of his progeny into the future, even the distant future, behold a rainbow following a rainstorm, that they're to be reminded by the rainbow of this covenantal promise, this forever covenantal promise that God will never destroy the world by flood again. Now, this covenant with Noah still exists to this day. It has not been subsumed by any covenant that came afterward. It has not been abrogated by any covenant that came afterward or eliminated altogether. It still exists to this day. When you and I see a rainbow in the sky, we know that God is faithful to his everlasting covenant never to destroy the world by flood again. Now, the next covenant that's relevant to this is and probably this is the most controversial of all the covenants, the Abrahamic covenant. Now, I spoke at length about this in the first episode I did about Tucker, called Untangling the Web of Tucker's Confusion. It's from a few weeks ago, and you can find it in the archive of my videos. And I spoke about it again last week or 2 Fridays ago in my interview with Athey Creek's Brett Metter. Now, at the heart of the Abrahamic covenant is the covenant of nationhood between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the ethnic nation of Israel. It is the covenant of statehood as well as the bequeathing of the land of Israel to that nation. And like the covenant with Noah, it is forevermore or everlasting. And just like the covenant with Noah, contingent on Yahweh's faithfulness alone, not on the behavior of any of Abraham's descendants to come after him. Now, this is brought to a powerful symbolism in a famous story in which God orders Abraham to take several animals, to cut these animals in halves, and to form an avenue of sorts between the halved animals. Now, this was a very well-known covenant in the ancient Near East in which 2 parties to a covenant would walk together down the avenue created between the 2 halved animal rows, hand in hand or arms locked, arm locked in arm, okay? And as they would be walking together past the halved animals, what they were saying to one another in essence was, if I break my part of the deal, may I be butchered like these animals here to each of our sides, okay? Now, in this story, God himself walks between the halved animals, not God and Abraham together. And therefore, what God is saying unitarily is that if I don't keep my covenant, if I'm not faithful to keep it forevermore, may I be butchered like these animals. You can't make a more powerful statement than that concerning the Abrahamic covenant, and it's being contingent on Yahweh's faithfulness alone. And that covenant still exists to this day. For God has preserved the nation of Israel, and he has restored the Jewish people in our own day to the land of Israel after not being sovereign there for over 2,000 years. This is something unparalleled in the annals of anthropology or sociology, in the annals of human history. For even a non-believer should be struck by how unique this is in the history of peoples and the history of nations. And if you've heard me in my previous episodes, I've said that the whole reason why God is doing this Israel thing is to shout from the rooftops to the world, to both his own people, the Jews, as well as the Gentiles looking on from both near and afar. I'm still that Yahweh of the Old Testament. I'm still that Yahweh, that covenant maker and covenant keeper of the Hebrew Bible, whether people like it or not. Now, moving on, it would be remiss of me not to mention 2 other covenants at play here, which is the first of which is the Mosaic covenant. Now, of all the covenants that I've mentioned and will mention, this is the only one that is contingent upon the behavior of the recipients of the covenant, this case being the Jewish people. Okay, God gave us, the Jewish people, a codified law called in Hebrew the Torah, which is translated usually by the non-Jewish world as the law. Okay, now I don't want to get picky here. It's more than law. Torah means to guide, to teach, but we all know that the crux of it is the Mosaic code, the law, okay? And it was contingent upon our faithfulness to keep it. The problem is we, the Jews, did not keep it. And our history as a people is just one long litany of unfaithfulness to that covenant. So God announces through his prophet Jeremiah that he's going to update that covenant. Now, notice I chose the word update as opposed to totally jettison or to repeal, okay? Because if you read the wording of Jeremiah 31:31, or those few verses that include Jeremiah 31:31, it really is referring to this updating of the Mosaic covenant, taking it from what it used to be, a code of law inscribed on stone, and internalizing it instead by inscribing it on the hearts of the house of Israel. Now, that's also very important here, that the new covenant spoken of in Jeremiah 31:31 still has the nation of Israel at its heart. Okay, thus saith the Lord to the whole house of Israel. It's the house of Israel that he's speaking to directly in Jeremiah 31:31. That the law of Moses, which previously was on tablets, shall now be inscribed on our hearts, so that now our very natures will be inclined to do what those natures previously couldn't do. And that would find its ultimate fulfillment in the final covenant that I'm going to speak about, which of course is the new covenant of Jesus, okay, mentioned in the New Testament. The New Testament teaches that inscribing of the law of Moses on the heart of its recipients, the recipients of that covenant, takes place in putting a person's faith in Jesus, in his vicarious death on the cross, in his resurrection, and the taking possession of that new believer by the Holy Spirit afterward. And that Holy Spirit's indwelling in the believer now helps that believer to act out in their lives the moral essence of Moses's standard or Moses's law. There you have it, folks, in a nutshell. Okay, and hopefully over the last few minutes I didn't sow more confusion, but clearly presented all these covenants. So in conclusion to at least this part of the video, there's at least 3 covenants that are now concurrently in operation, one alongside the other. The first being the Noahide covenant, that God won't destroy the world by flood, and we're reminded of it every time we see the rainbow. The second is the Abrahamic covenant of statehood or nationhood, the Jewish people as God's forever nation, and his giving to that nation also forever all the lands of Canaan, what would be known later and up until our very day, except for its detractors who prefer to call it Palestine, but we'll call it what the Bible calls it, the land of Israel. And lastly, the third covenant that's currently, activated and in operation in those that have received it is the New Testament salvation of faith in Jesus, or Yeshua, that being his Hebrew name, for both the Jew and Gentile that believe in him. The problem is that Tucker and his supersessionists believe that everything but that new covenant has basically passed into oblivion. And the only people that haven't gotten the memo are those pesky Christian Zionists who still believe, as I have just stated, in all these other covenants that God himself stated that are forever, that they're still active to this day. So here's this clip of Tucker just totally dissing these Christian Zionists and basically referring to them as his least favorite tribe of people on the planet. Take a listen.
How do you explain Mike Huckabee, Ted Cruz, and there are a lot like that, John Bolton. I mean, I've known them all, George W. Bush, like Karl Rove. I mean, all people I know personally who I've seen like be seized by this brain virus, and they're not Jewish. Most of them are self-described Christians, and then the Christian Zionists who are, well, Christian Zionists. Like, what is that?
Right.
And I can just say for myself, I dislike them more than anybody, because like, what?
Now, what Tucker fails to see is that it's actually his own theological presuppositions that are related to the most ancient heresy known to Christianity. Now, before I give it the name of it, which I did at the very beginning of the video, but before I repeat the name of this heresy and go into further detail about it, I'm going to switch for just a moment from Tucker to another individual who's become very much in the news the last couple of weeks, that being Nick Fuentes. Okay, I'm going to let Nick introduce the heresy to you. Now, of course, Nick is not referring to it as a heresy, but as you'll see, Nick clearly presents his theological presupposition to which Tucker and other supersessionists agree with as it relates to the relationship between the New Testament and what I've called the Hebrew Bible, or what they call dismissively the Old Testament. So take a listen to this very short explanation by Nick Fuentes.
So, but the difference is, Christians, a lot of Christians have this idea that, we all read the Bible. The Jews are the Old Testament, we're the New Testament. But the New Testament, the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament, it's not a sequel. The New Testament and the theology in it replaces the theology of the Old Testament.
Now, that, my friends, is the oldest Christian heresy. What Nick succinctly just summarized, the replacing of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible with the New Testament. Now, this replacement theology that Nick and Tucker and others subscribe to, I'll argue, has its origins in a movement that had its center in ancient Alexandria, Egypt, known as Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism is called by the name, it derives its name from the Greek word for knowledge, which is gnosis, usually spelled in English transliteration as Gnosis. Some people pronounce it as gnosis, but I'm going to pronounce it as gnosis, and hence Gnosticism. Now, what did the heresy of Gnosticism believe, and what did it teach? Well, Gnosticism believed in a superior being named Monad. Okay, Monad is the superior. He stands at the pantheon of gods. And from him all light emanates. And between him and those of us here on earth are these intermediate beings, or these intermediary beings known as ions. Now, among the lowest of these beings is the creator of the planet, the God of creation of the Old Testament, Yahweh, who's referred by Gnosticism as, or by the Greek term demiurgos. Demiurgos in classical Greek refers to a skilled craftsman. That can be a leather worker, that can be somebody who forges iron, a blacksmith, okay? That can be somebody who sits at the potter's wheel and cranks out bowls, a skilled craftsman. But according to Gnosticism, Yahweh is not just a skilled craftsman, but he's evil. He has an evil heart. In fact, they liken him often to Satan, okay? So a complete inverse of the Bible's view or high view of Yahweh. Okay, Yahweh is this malevolent God, this at best a skilled craftsman who created this material world. This material world is evil, and all of us as souls are imprisoned in our material bodies. And only those of us who are counseled to this esoteric knowledge, again, knowledge, gnosis in Greek, hence Gnosticism, only those of us who are guided to the light of this esoteric knowledge or gnosis can be ultimately freed from these bodies to rejoin the supreme being, monad, in the ether. And according to the Gnostics, Jesus is that counselor or guide who guides us to that esoteric knowledge. Jesus is, according to the Gnostics, or at least to some of them, the embodiment of that supreme being, monad. Although there's other Gnostics that believe, of course, because this world is so evil, that everything material is evil, that there's no way Jesus was ever embodied at all, but rather when he was here on earth just appeared as an embodied person, but remained a ghost, if you will, or remained an angel of sorts. Now, am I claiming that Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson and the millions of Christians who embrace replacement theology are adherents of this philosophy, this heresy of ancient Gnosticism? Of course not. I'm not claiming that Tucker or Nick Fuentes have ever studied the subject or conversant with its constituents or elements of this philosophy. The problem is that in the 2nd century AD, there was a church father named Marcion who did embrace Gnosticism. And he believed that basically the New Testament and its God are totally or wholly separated from the Old Testament and its God. So according to Marcion, the Old Testament must be cast aside, for it is the book of that evil demiurgos, Yahweh, that malevolent God. The Gospels that depict Jesus as a practitioner of Judaism, or keeping the laws of that God, keeping the ordinances of that God, that too needs to be excised from the Bible. And all that really remains of Marcion's Bible are bits and pieces of the Gospel of John and several of Paul's letters, although not all of them. Now, Marcion would be declared a heretic, and rather than the Old Testament officially be cast away from the Bible, Christianity, it would be Marcion who was cast out and excommunicated. The problem is that I'll argue that even though Marcion was cast out or excommunicated, much of the overtones and undertones of what Marcion believed trickled in to what would become Christianity. And this belief, basically, that the New Testament and the Jesus of the New Testament is somewhat separate and different from the Yahweh of the Old Testament, who these people dismiss as tribalistic. He's an anachronism, this anachronistic God of tribalism, of ethnocentrism, of the real estate God, okay, the God who cares about this particular land of Israel, as opposed to the Jesus of the New Testament who transcends all of that, and whose gospel, of course, is universal and doesn't care at all whether you're Jew, Gentile, male, or female. Now, while that latter part may be true, the former parts that I just mentioned, that Jesus is distinct and wholly separate from the Yahweh of the Old Testament, and the penchant of these church supersessionists to sort of demote and degrade Yahweh. Now, they would never come out overtly and say that that's what they're doing, but that is really what they are doing. And Gnostics like Marcion, some of them would see the Old Testament as having some utility only to the extent that it could prove the Christological origins of Jesus from eternity. Okay, in other words, that Jesus existed from eternity. But other than those Christological elements of the Old Testament, they have no use for it, nor does the modern day supersessionists like Tucker or Nick. Now, Steve, are you sure that Tucker would degrade the Old Testament, treat it as sort of, passé, and treat it even irreverently? The answer is yes, and I'm going to prove it now in the next clip. Now, I've divided this next clip actually into two clips because I do want to make a few comments in the middle of the clip. Okay, so I want you to listen to the first part of this clip in which Tucker refers to the book of Deuteronomy. I want you to pay special attention to his referring to Amalek. Okay, that's very important. And as you'll see, Tucker, in his discussion of Amalek and the book of Deuteronomy, betrays a certain irreverence for the Old Testament, and of course, by association, whether he'd admit it or not, the God of that Old Testament. Okay, so take a listen.
Mark Levin has repeatedly, and he's not the only one, but he's the most blunt, has repeatedly called for just murdering civilians, children in Gaza because they're Amalek or whatever. They're stained by blood guilt. The Prime Minister of Israel said exactly the same thing. They are guilty by virtue of how they were born. So that, by definition, includes women and children. So Mark Levin is not clever enough to keep the implications of these views to himself, and he said them repeatedly on television, just to give you a sense about how Mark Levin feels about human life and the human soul. Watch this.
And I'm supposed to, what? Shed crocodile tears for what's going to happen to these people? I'm not. Maybe I'm the only one who will voice it, but I'm not.
Okay, I have selected to interrupt this clip in mid-flight because I have to address what I'm going to call the blood libel here of Tucker Carlson. Now, I'm choosing my words here very carefully. What do I mean by blood libel? Blood libel refers to the ancient accusation of the Jewish people by their enemies, particularly in Christian Europe, but it also happened in Damascus, Syria in the 1800s. This charge that the Jews once a year, namely on the holiday of Passover, would kidnap a Christian child and sacrifice, in human sacrifice, that Christian child behind the scenes, in secret, and use the blood of that child to make our Passover matzot, those cracker-like wafers that many of you are familiar with that we, the Jews, eat at Passover. Now, this, of course, is not true. Nowhere in Judaism has this ever been practiced. Nowhere in Jewish sources, including the Talmud, which is often vilified, by Israel's detractors or Judaism's detractors. Nowhere is this an ordinance to kidnap a Gentile child or Christian child and sacrifice them and use their blood to make our Passover wafers. But that is what the Jews were accused of by medieval Christians in Europe, as well as Muslims as recently as the 1800s in Damascus, Syria. This is called blood libel, the libel of the Jews purposefully shedding the blood of Gentiles in a callous, ritualistic, murderous kind of way to further our religion, to further our interest. And this blood libel was often followed by pogroms or massacres, bloodfests in which thousands of Jews were killed, all because of this false rumor being spread by our detractors or our enemies, both in Europe and in the Middle East. Now, Tucker here, in my opinion, is engaging in such a blood libel. Here, he's falsely accusing Mark Levin and Israel at large in canvassing or pursuing the policy of genocide towards the Palestinians. It simply is not true. Not in any way true. What is true is that in the last couple years, Israel's been fighting an existential war against a very callous, vicious, inhumane enemy that uses its own civilians as human shields. Now, if you listen to military experts, and I'm thinking particularly of a guy by the name, his last name is Spencer. For some reason, I forget his first name at the moment. I'm tempted to say it's John, okay, but maybe it isn't. Just know that he's the leading expert in the world in urban combat, and he teaches, I believe, at West Point. And he's gone on record as saying that Israel, more than any army in history, has gone out of its way to mitigate the collateral damage, which is a fancy word of saying the killing of innocents inadvertently in warfare. Okay. Now, according to Hamas's run Ministry of Health, 60, 70, 1,000 people have been killed in this war, and Hamas would want you to believe that this is mostly women and children. Israel concedes that maybe half of that has been non-combatants, but according to people like Professor Spencer, this would still make the ratio of innocent to combatants that Israel has killed in this war the lowest in the history of warfare, and lower than even America's statistics in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, so has Israel been on this intentional pursuit of the genocide of the Palestinian people? Of course not. It's hard to argue that during a war in which Israel has sent millions of text messages to Palestinians warning them of imminent attack in their localities, providing them with maps of where to flee to, in sending dummy bombs, what's called knocking on the roof. In other words, rockets or bombs from airplanes that have no TNT explosives in them to hit the building first before the real munition comes to do the damage, again, to warn the people of their impending doom if they don't flee. And lastly, anybody whose intent is genocide would not be feeding their enemies, as Israel has throughout the war. So here in this clip, Tucker is engaging in such a slander, such a libel that's baseless. And of course, I'm likening it to the lie that I just referred to in medieval times, this blood libel, this accusation that the Jews are just obsessed with, or secretly behind the scenes are offering up Gentiles basically for sacrifice to further our ends. And it is false, and such accusations in the past have led to dreadful consequences for us, the Jews. And unfortunately, people like Tucker are spinning these same accusations today on mass media, okay, or social media platforms that have millions of people as their audiences. Tucker has over 5 million people that listen to him, as does Nick Fuentes, as does Candace Owens, who's probably the leading slanderer of the Jewish people today on social media. So I just wanted to interrupt this clip of Tucker to address that blood libel, okay? But I want to now go back to the main theme of the video, and it's sort of insinuated, well, it's referred to in the beginning of that clip in this referring to Amalek. Okay, now Tucker refers to Amalek in the context of this blood guilt. He accuses us, the Jews, of killing the Palestinians collectively and intentionally because we see them as guilty of iniquity by virtue of their birth, by virtue of their DNA. And again, nothing that Mark Levin said in any of those clips, and nothing that Israel has said in officialdom over the last few years has betrayed that at all. Okay, but this is what Tucker is imputing, this collective punishment, this collective killing of the Palestinians because of blood guilt. And he likens this to the group known in Old Testament times as Amalek. And here in this second part of the clip, you're going to hear him refer to Amalek again, as well as to the book of Deuteronomy, in a way that betrays Tucker's heart and theology towards the Old Testament in general. And in my opinion, by association, it's God, Yahweh. So listen to the second part of this clip.
Like cattle, treat them like human beings. And finally, the last lesson to learn from all of this is that there is no Amalek. Deuteronomy describes a tribe that is beyond redemption and must be killed, period, because they have blood guilt. Their DNA, as Mark Levin explained on Twitter, makes them evil, and they must be destroyed, every one of them. Not just the fighting-age men, but their wives and their kids and their parents all must be killed, because we're not just killing a foreign army, we're killing a strain of genetics. Because that's where the sin comes from, their genetics. We do not acknowledge that. We cannot allow that attitude. That will wind up like Rwanda right away, like quickly in our lifetimes. We will see mass killing if we don't get that attitude under control. It's the attitude that animated the Nazis. It's the attitude that really is behind all mass slaughter in history, and we can't have it in the West, period. So once you accept that, then you also have to acknowledge that there are no permanent enemies, that we disagree with people. We may violently disagree, passionately disagree. I hate what you're saying. But and this is a Christian imperative as well, but also it's like a prerequisite for continuing to exist. You have to acknowledge and say out loud that if people change, or if you change, because we all do change, and when we're under pressure, we change much more quickly. All of us are changing right now. It's imperceptible to us usually. But keep a daily diary and look at it 5 years from now. You're a different person. You change. And so do all the people around you. And because that is true, some people will change for the worse. Some people will change for the better. We cannot have permanent enemies, period. It's immoral to imagine that someone must always be your enemy, that he's an Amalekite or whatever.
Well, folks, as we see in this clip, Tucker has a problem, and one could even say an irreverence for the Old Testament. And I would argue by association, it's deity Yahweh. Now, what's interesting is that this puts Tucker in league with atheists, okay? And to the extent because atheists use Deuteronomy's Amalekites, and they also feature in 1 Samuel chapter 15 as an example as to why nobody should believe in the Bible's God, okay? That he's this cruel, vindictive, evil being not worthy of reverence or belief. Okay, so there's a reason why Tucker, like these atheists, referred to this famous verse, or let's say infamous verses in Deuteronomy about the Amalekites. Now, just to review for you, the Amalekites were the original nemesis of the Jewish people, and they feature or loom large in the Exodus story. When the Israelites are on their sojourn to the Promised Land, the Amalekites features the main nemesis that fights them to keep them from going to the Promised Land and fulfilling their destiny. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19, God instructs the Israelites to remember the Amalekites and to destroy them entirely, to basically wipe their memory from beneath the heavens. Okay, and in 1 Samuel 15, God instructs King Saul to destroy the Amalekites, man, woman, child, their beasts, their herds, their sheep, their goats, their cattle. Now, not just atheists who argue against the Bible, but here a professing Christian like Tucker has a problem with this part of the Bible. And while I'm not claiming that Tucker embraces, the systematic theology of the heresy of Gnosticism, like the Gnostics, Tucker seems to want to demote the Old Testament and its God Yahweh, again, as this anachronistic, tribalistic, vindictive, ethnocentric avenger God who's not worthy of the worship and reverence of enlightened Christians such as himself. The problem, folks, is that God doesn't give the believer the option to accept some parts of the Bible and discard others, no matter how problematic those other parts are, no matter how embarrassing to believers some of those parts are. Because what it comes down to is the sovereignty of God to act as he chooses over his creation, even when his sovereign decisions and interactions with that creation don't conform to our ideals of God. You see, folks, many believers and many Christians basically want a God tailor fit to their own preferences. It reminds me of a place called Build-A-Bear Workshop. Maybe you have one of them in your town at the local mall. I remember many years ago when my mom and I used to take trips into Manhattan to see Broadway shows. We would go with her best friend who lived down the street from us. And before the show, I loved these Broadway shows. My favorite one was The Phantom of the Opera. To this day, I love the music from The Phantom of the Opera. But before the play, my mom and her friend would spend a couple hours shopping, and boy, did I find that to be torture. I don't think there's anything more torturing for a lot of guys than to go on these shopping escapades with women, okay? Or at least in this case, my mom, where she and her friend go to shoe stores and purse stores and boot stores. And man, I just couldn't wait for the play, in part to see the play, but as well as to get past all this shopping stuff. But one of the places that I remember my mom and her friend going in this pre-Broadway show viewing shopping escapade was this Build-A-Bear Workshop, where you can assemble or tailor a bear to your own personal preferences, or to that, of course, of your child or your grandchild. Here's some examples. Here's Farmer Bear. Check this out. There's even a Philadelphia Eagles bear. That's awesome. And here's one that I didn't expect to see, a Pop the Question bear. And lastly, a Fireman bear. See, at the Build-A-Bear Workshop, you can build a teddy bear to your specifications that's form fit to your whims and desires. The problem, folks, is that God cannot be similarly tailor fit to conform to our ideal of him. He's the sovereign of the universe. He's the king of the cosmos, and we are but clay vessels. He does what he wants, and he doesn't come to us for approval. It's for us to accept him for who he is, according to the full counsel of the Bible regarding who he is, or to not accept him at all. And what Tucker is doing here, consistent with the Gnostics of old, even if he doesn't subscribe to their systematic theology, is he's discarding the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, the God of Israel, Yahweh, the covenantal God of Noah, the covenantal God of Abraham, because according to Tucker and his fellow travelers, that God is a God of bloodlust, a God of collective punishment, a God who chooses or discards entire races based on their DNA. Whereas the Jesus of the New Testament, well, he's entirely separate from that God. He transcends all of that. His gospel's universal, and he's the God of suffer the children to come unto me. But he shares nothing in common with the God of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19. But folks, that conclusion is the oldest blasphemy known in Christianity. It's not the belief of the Christian Zionists in their confirming that the God of today keeps his covenants of old, whether they be to Noah or whether they be to Abraham. It's not this heresy that Tucker associates with Christian Zionism, but rather it's the heresy of Tucker to disassociate the Jesus of the New Testament and the New Testament itself largely from the God and scriptures of the Old Testament. That, my friends, is the oldest heresy known to Christendom. And the truth is, for those of us who know the Bible from cover to cover, who celebrate the Bible from cover to cover, is that Jesus embodies the full spectrum of who the God of the Bible is, both the God of suffer the children to come unto me, but also that God of Deuteronomy chapter 25 and 1 Samuel 15. For when Jesus returns in the book of Revelation, in Zechariah chapters 12 and 14, he comes back as a God in judgment of the wicked. He comes back as that very vengeful being that Tucker and his fellow travelers would rather pretend doesn't exist at all. And if you have a problem with that, too bad, because God is not appealing to your sensitivities. He's not seeking your approval. He is the sovereign of the cosmos. He does what he wants, and he's extended to all of us an invitation to be his subjects, to give him the benefit of the doubt that he knows what he's doing, and that in the end, it will all make sense. Well, folks, that's this episode. If you want to treat Steve the tour guide to a cup of coffee, you can do so by way of my Ko-fi link that I'll add to the bottom of the video in the extended description of the video. But it's time to bring this episode to an end. I wish you all a wonderful remainder of the week. We're just at the beginning here. I'm making this on a Monday, although I probably won't get this posted until Tuesday. But the whole week's ahead of us. Enjoy yourselves as you prepare for Thanksgiving and all the goodies to eat. And man, it's one of my favorite holidays. And I think I got to go out soon myself on hunt for a good turkey to make here at the home. Anyway, folks, this is Steve the tour guide signing off. Bye-bye.